You're listening to Natural Resources University. In this podcast network, our hosts are university researchers and extension specialists, opening your gateway to the science of natural resource management.
Welcome to Habitat University. This podcast is your source for the science behind wildlife habitat management and is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network. We're your hosts, Jared Brook.
And I'm Adam Janke, and we're both biologists and extension wildlife specialists. If you're interested in wildlife habitat management or looking for ways to improve your property for wildlife, this is the podcast for you.
So join us as we talk with researchers, managers, and landowners all about the latest research and the ins and outs of wildlife habitat management. And we're back with another episode of Habitat University. And Adam, we've made it through the 5 tools of habitat management, right?
Yeah.
Success?
Yeah, we did it. And we've been like halfway around the country while we did it, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, I think we got some good diversity of parts of the country in the different interviews. So I think we've represented some different ecosystems and different management styles and things like that. So
yeah, it was really fun. We went to Florida. Was it Tennessee? Is that where Jordan
Tennessee,
was?
yeah.
Okay, Tennessee. We went to Minnesota, the upper Midwest and Great Plains with the cow episode. Out to Colorado for the gun, and then stuck right here in Iowa for the plow episode. So yeah, that's fun to get that diversity of perspectives and really start thinking about these things.
yeah, so for this episode, we kind of have a plan. We want to kind of recap, maybe hit some of the highlights of the episodes that we've already recorded. And we kind of want to take it and say, what did Aldo miss? What are some things that maybe he missed that weren't included in those original 5 tools? And maybe what are some new things that weren't around or weren't available as habitat management tools back in the 1930s that maybe we have now? So we're going to kind of start with the recap of the episodes and then go into some of those other tools.
Yeah, and I guess to just jump right in here, the thing that I just can't stop thinking about with these 5 episodes that we did and these 5 different experts from all walks of life is how almost without exception, each of the tools was at first in America during the period of European colonization, overused, like during the Industrial Revolution and into the early 1900s, like grossly overused, and led to the widespread degradation and in some cases extinction of some species of wildlife. And then almost without exception, they were all completely suppressed. So we stopped. Well, I mean, that's not entirely true of cows, but that was the inclination, at least of professional wildlife biologists, was like, get it out of here. No more gun, no more cow, Smokey the bear, and no more fire, no more timber harvest. That was sort of the inclination. And then I think what the lesson from every single one of these specialists that we just visited with was, all things in moderation. We've got to understand how these things fit in and how we can use them to benefit wildlife, live alongside wildlife. In some cases have profitable farms right along with wildlife, or have profitable timber production operations, and still have habitat for the diversity of wildlife species that we're interested in. That's something I just can't quite get over. I just think it was really interesting in a thread that connected each one of those 5 episodes.
Yeah, I think that's some really good insight. And I think, what's it been? Almost 90 years since the book was written, Game Management was written. I think we've learned a lot in that time period about how to use these tools, and we're still learning more every day. There's awesome research projects going on looking at using these different tools to create and manage habitat for wildlife. But we learned a lot from our mistakes, and it was probably needed that we needed to take a break and say, all right, what we're doing isn't working. maybe we need to rethink about how we use these tools as management tools.
Yeah. Yeah. In some cases, we needed to remember that people had been using these tools on this continent to manage wildlife populations forever. That was definitely the case with fire, right? Like native people were using fire as a habitat management tool long before European settlers got here and created all this sort of havoc on these systems. And so in some cases, it just took the profession of wildlife management and wildlife conservation that evolved out of the early 1900s in America to recognize the knowledge that was already held in these communities and how we should be managing these ecosystems, how people should be managing these ecosystems for these wildlife species.
And you're certainly seeing that more and more these days about utilizing that, what people call traditional ecological knowledge, as a way to kind of move forward with some of these different practices.
Yeah.
Fire is kind of the perfect example of that.
Yeah, fire's definitely the perfect example of that. But you're right, it's true in all these systems. I know, like, I read about in Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, about basket weavers and how they were, managing forested ecosystems to ensure that they had forest resources for making baskets and other culturally important things. So yeah, we know those stories are out there, and there's something they have to be uncovered and then applied to manage these wildlife populations that definitely evolved with people for thousands of years, and of course will continue to evolve with people forever. We'll always be working side by side with these wildlife species and the ecosystems they're dependent on.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that I took away about these different episodes was kind of the interplay and the interconnectedness of all of these tools. And I know when you listen to episodes, sometimes some of the interviewees had to kind of stop themselves and keep themselves within the sideboards of the specific tool they were talking about. But it's hard to do when you think about, how the Great Plains evolved with the interaction of fire and grazing, and then of course drought, which we learned about. Mm-hmm. So you got to think about how these tools interact, and it's not just one tool for one application in one place. It's how can I couple these tools together to meet the management objectives I have.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and that is funny. I definitely noticed that on the cow episode. Marissa would occasionally like go down the fire road, and then you could see she's like, "But we're just talking about cows." But I am so tempted to go down this because they are, you can't have one without the other. The animals, grazing animals, respond to the fire, and the fire responds to the way that the grazing animals change the vegetation, and the plants, of course, are responding, and the wildlife follow in kind. So yeah, they're very connected. In fact, they're basically all connected. The other connection I was thinking about, in the gun episode, we talked about overabundant deer populations. And so if we take everything that Jordan taught us in the axe episode about forest management, regenerating desirable tree species for wildlife, for soft mass production or timber production or whatever the landowner's goal is, and you put overabundant white-tailed deer populations on top of it, and it's never going to work. And that's where it connects to the gun. Axe and gun connects in that way. Fire and cow connect really nicely. And then, of course, the other one I was thinking about is the plow and the cow connect, because there's lots of traditional connections between livestock production and row crop production, what we sort of think of as conventional agriculture, and integrating that can be really important for both wildlife and the farm.
Yeah, so we have maybe overuse in the beginning, and now we're kind of getting to a better understanding of how to use these tools creatively, right? That's the key word in that quote, creatively, to create habitat for wildlife. And then we're learning about how they're all really interconnected, and we need to think about using them in different ways and using them together to create and manage habitat for whatever wildlife species we're interested in. So with that, I kind of want to take a little bit of time and maybe go through the episodes one by one and kind of say, hey, what is the key thing about this tool that you learned? And I think what we'll do is I'll take the episodes that you recorded and did the interviews, Adam, and you can take the episodes that I did the interview.
Yeah, great.
So which way you want to start? Do you want to start or do you want me to start?
I'm just dying to talk about this thing from the fire episode, so I'll
All right,
start.
let's do it.
I
So what did you learn from the fire episode?
I can't stop thinking about when Marcus talked about how in fire adapted ecosystem, the disturbance is the absence of the fire. It's not the fire itself. And it's such an important insight. And I guess I work a lot on the wildlife, like working lands wildlife side. I guess I just don't work in like that disturbance ecology type world. So maybe that's like not as insightful for everybody else, but I just have to say, like, I think I can remember like where I was when I like actually heard him say that, because it just really sort of blew my mind, like to think about that, like, oh, that's so important. Of course, if you're a jack pine stand, the fire is normal. Like the fire is what those serotinous cones need to open up and reproduce. And the absence of fire is the quote disturbance. Like removing fire from that system is the quote disturbance. And that would apply, of course, to the cow. And in fact, I recorded the cow episode after having already listened to the fire episode. And I was thinking about it during that because, with like removing the cow, or in fact, removing the bison or grazing animal from the prairie, that's the disturbance. It's not reintroducing that natural function. It's the removal of it. So I will say, for me, that fire, I just can't stop thinking about that. That was a really interesting insight from that episode.
Yeah, it kind of caught me off guard when he was talking about that too, because you don't really think about it. You think it sounds kind of backwards when you think about it, but the more you consider how many thousands of years these plant species and animal species have evolved with the use of fire, it makes sense, right? And in the absence of fire, these systems are going to be degraded. And I like that you brought jack pines in there, because that's like the perfect example in our world. And you actually can find jack pines in Indiana. I saw them at the Indiana Dunes National Park this summer.
Oh, that's cool.
But it's a kind of perfect example because you hit on the serotinous cones. And if people aren't familiar with what a serotinous cone is essentially those pine cones have to be heated to a certain temperature in order for them to open up and release their seeds. So if they never make it to that temperature, then they're never going to reproduce. So they are literally adapted to fire, or fire dependent.
Fire dependent, yeah. Yep. Very cool. Okay, you go on one now.
Okay, so I think I'm going to take I'll start with the cow episode. That's the most recent one I've listened to, so it's easy. It's on top of my head. So one little kind of cool factoid I learned, and this wasn't my major takeaway, but I kind of found that it was interesting when Marissa was talking about the differences in cows and bisons and what that has to do with their impacts on vegetation composition and structure, and specifically related to how bison eat versus how cows eat. Yeah, and then also their relationship to trees and water was really interesting, because you never really think about that.
Yeah.
But I think
that was real. That got me too. I like the way that they actually bite vegetation being a way that they can actually differently impact habitat management goals. I was just like, what?
And how they move around, and the fact that bison make wallows, and cattle don't tend to make wallows, and that's all really cool stuff. It's kind of the on the ground, boots on the ground type stuff that's really cool to me. Yeah. But I think the thing that I took away that was the most interesting was when she talked about the fact that what grazing system people used really didn't impact the structure of the vegetation, and therefore the composition of the bird species between all those different ones, but it was a stocking rate and the duration of grazing, which is most important. Because I found that's interesting, because I think a lot of times when we talk about grazing and wildlife, the kind of blanket recommendation is, rotational grazing is better than full rotation or full duration grazing for wildlife. And you hear that, I certainly hear that a lot of times, and I've probably been guilty of saying it as well. But what that brings to light is that what's really more important is what's the stocking rate within those systems, and what's the duration of grazing in those systems. And that's going to be what's related to the structure of the vegetation and how wildlife are going to respond.
Yeah. Yeah. And it all came down to like a bunch of different examples that she worked through. Like it all came down to how much heterogeneity there was like within the pasture. And then arguably even more importantly, like among the pastures in the landscape. And she talked about that example from the national grasslands, Cheyenne National Grasslands, I think, in southeastern North Dakota. And they did that study where they were like, oh, do we keep them out or do we keep them on or what do we do? And yeah, what really mattered was just creating heterogeneity, like in all of its forms. And I think we talked about this when we introduced the concept of succession a few episodes ago before we started this 5-episode things. But that's like the whole like intermediate disturbance hypothesis, like, or the Goldilocks principle, which is like, too much disturbance is bad, too little disturbance is bad, right in the middle is just right. And I think that's the takeaway from the cow episode is like, find ways to create heterogeneity and diversity, and you're going to create a bunch of diverse wildlife habitat.
So I think it probably goes without saying that with all of these tools, we'll definitely be having follow-up interviews with different people in different ecosystems to see how these tools work in different areas, right?
Yeah. And that would actually be a perfect way for me to segue to the next episode we talked about, the interview you did with Jordan on the axe. One like just sort of totally superficial takeaway was like all the tree diversity he talked about. I was like, I've lived west of the Mississippi River for like, I don't know, like a decade now or something like that. And I lived in South Dakota for half of that time. And like in South Dakota, there's like one species of oak and then like they planted green ash. And I mean, of course in the Black Hills, it's different, but like where I lived in South Dakota, it's super arid. And here, even here in Iowa, like we don't have that much tree diversity. I think we have 12 species of oaks found in southeastern Iowa, but that's like the most diversity we find. And Jordan would just have these like long lists of species that would benefit or not benefit from whatever silvicultural practice. And it was just funny. I was like, dang, I'm glad I'm not a forester or wildlife biologist in like East Tennessee where there's just this insane amount of diversity because of, you know, I mean, that part of the world is like globally known for its biological diversity, of course, the Appalachian foothills and stuff. But that was sort of a superficial takeaway that I had from the Axe episode for sure.
Yeah, it's a neat system. And I actually took a silviculture class when I was in Tennessee, and that was one of the comments they made is, you know, there's so many species. If you can practice forestry in the Appalachian Mountains, then you can practice forestry in a lot of different places just because of the amount of diversity.
Yeah. And I think a lot of what he talked about, I mean, we hear the same kind of discussions. In fact, you guys talked about shelterwood harvest and said like that's where you find the most bird diversity. And we find this very similar things here. And I know of work in Ohio that found the same thing with bats. And yeah, I mean, I think those generalizations apply. And I think that brings us back to that intermediate disturbance hypothesis stuff too. The other takeaway, the more substantive takeaway that I had from the Axe episode was the timescales that forest management is occurring at. And I think, I mean, it is true that people in like grassland or wetland ecosystems where I tend to do my research and education in think on longer timescales, but like nobody is planning things at 100-year timescales. And like Jordan and also you in talking about the hardwood ecosystem experiment at Purdue, we're just sort of like casually talking about like plans for what things would look like at 100 years. And it really stuck to me, you know, like every ecosystem we manage wildlife habitat in is gonna like there is this temporal aspect, and you may do something that looks really bad for 2, 3, 10 years, even like a clear cut or something, but it's going to get you to an ecosystem that's best for your management goals over a 20, 30, 100 year time frame. And I just think that's like almost we almost need to think like that. Like that's really important. And it shows the importance of planning and things that we're going to talk about more in an episode here later in the season.
So now is it back to me? All right. So the plow, I thought it was a really interesting conversation that you had with Ryan. And the two things that stuck out to me were, and you kind of hit on it, how optimistic he was that the stars are aligning to benefit conservation in agricultural lands. It's really refreshing to hear, especially from a person that's so engrossed in those, in the intermix of those fields. So to hear him say that, things are looking positive for the future for wildlife conservation on ag land was really good to hear. And I think it brings me to my next point. I think one of the reasons that is, and one of the things that I know Quail Forever and Pheasants Forever has been doing a lot with, is that precision conservation field and identifying where's the best place to put habitat on a farm that's going to be the most economically beneficial, but also beneficial to wildlife species.
Yeah. I had the same takeaway that like Ryan was just a really cool guest to have on because he both farms and he's a wildlife biologist with like a really neat, diverse resume of experiences. And the level at which he's thinking about how wildlife fit together in working agricultural landscapes is just really interesting to sort of capture. And here we're talking about autonomous tractors and drones and precision technology and all this stuff just to create like some wildlife habitat on the margins of farms. And it's pretty cool. I mean, it's an exciting new discipline, and it does offer promise that we would be able to have, this better coexistence on that particularly challenging landscape.
Yeah, I think it's if you think about the precision conservation side of things, like it makes sense from a wildlife standpoint so that we're spending the money wisely to put habitat on the ground where it's the most effective. But also makes sense from a farmer standpoint or this is their business, this is their livelihood. And now we can kind of blend that and say, where's the best place to put habitat on the ground for whatever wildlife species we're interested in? And where's the best place on the farm to put it for the landowner and the farmer's pocket and their operations, and blend those things and find win-win solutions.
Yeah, that's definitely a very promising development. I think a place where wildlife biologists are going to play a big role in sort of championing those causes on the margins of farm fields.
Yeah. So I guess I'm up again, right? Because you did 3 interviews, so I got to do 3 wrap-ups now.
Yeah, that's right.
All right. So the last episode, The Gun with Pat Dorsey, I really enjoyed this episode. I have not met Pat, but we are mutually connected through the CLFT program, or Conservation Leaders for Tomorrow. And I think one of the big takeaways that I had from that episode was the amount of acreage that these NGOs like NWTF, Ducks Unlimited, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, the amount of land that they work to, purchase, conserve, manage is just, it's kind of eye-opening. And I did the math. I had a calculator when she went through it. And just of the 4 organizations that she mentioned, that represents 45 million acres of conservation. So, and that's all on the back of voluntary donations from sportsmen and women. Yeah,
it was really neat. That one was, like we discussed, it's like a little bit less of a direct connection to wildlife habitat management, but through the advocacy work of sportsmen and women, you're right that she made this really interesting and compelling connection. And her organization, the National Wild Turkey Federation, is definitely leading on this stuff with their Save the Habitat, Save the Hunt type work. And it does just show the importance of getting people engaged in these places where wildlife live and thrive, and then getting people engaged in championing those places and managing them.
All right. So we've made it through the kind of recap of these 5 tools in 5 episodes, before we kind of dive into the ones that we may think that Aldo Leopold missed or weren't available to him at the time, I kind of want to run you through an analogy, Adam. And my brain works in weird ways, and that I like to have analogies to things that kind of help me better understand. And so we talk about toolboxes a lot, right? This is the manager's toolbox. This is the tools he has in his toolbox. So I probably shouldn't admit how much time I spent trying to figure out how these tools relate to a toolbox you would have in your house, right? So I'm going to kind of run you through and try to justify my answers to you, Adam, and it's going to be up to you to decide.
Okay. I like the big setup you've got here.
Yeah, if I'm
we got
onto
a lot
something,
of pressure,
or if I'm just, I should probably not spend that much time thinking about it later on. But anyway, so the first one I'm going to go with is the axe, right? And before I go any further, you could probably make justifications that a lot of these tools, could be whatever tool in the toolbox. I picked the ones that I think are the most relatable. And so with the axe, I'm not going to say that the axe is like a saw or like an axe. That's just too easy.
It would be. I was actually like, I don't actually think this one's going to be that hard. Okay.
Yeah.
You've complicated it.
Yeah. I picked the hammer, right? And I
picked the axe as hammer.
Yeah. The axe is like a hammer in your toolbox.
An axe in this case as a metaphor for forestry and the way that we used it. Yeah. Yeah.
That's right.
Okay.
And I think that's, it's like a hammer because you can do a lot of things with it. It has a lot of applications, and there's a lot of different types of hammers. And I looked it up, and I found one reference that said there's 40 types of hammers.
Wow.
I didn't know that. That's crazy to me. But so it's probably akin to, there's more than 40 ways that you could manage a forest, right?
Yeah.
There's different, from a chainsaw up to a skidder and a feller buncher. There's different tools, but there's also different regeneration methods, different forest stand improvement methods that all have their applications in shaping the forest. And so if you think about and I'm going to take it even one step farther, like a ball peen hammer, right? A ball peen hammer is used to kind of shape metal and things like that. Or you can use a light touch to a forest with a chainsaw or something to kind of shape the composition and the structure of that forest. All the way up to a sledgehammer, which is used to maybe knock down a wall in a house or do things like that, where you could use forestry or forest management as a tool to completely restart a forest or regenerate a forest or convert a forest to an early successional area or something like that. So wide applications.
I'm buying that one. I like it. I like the forestry. I mean, and you guys talked about that. I mean, that was a thing I definitely took away from that episode was there was a lot of different there's a whole different language for silviculture. And the 40 some hammer metaphor. I like that. I wish I had a bell. I would ring a bell.
All right. So we're good. We'll just add a bell sound in here.
Okay, deal. One.
All right. So the next one is the cow. And I had the cow as like a wrench, and specifically like a socket wrench. And a socket wrench, and all right, you're laughing at me now, but I think I can convince you of this.
Only because I like how specific it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the cow's like a socket wrench because it has it's very useful, but it has a very precise application to it, right? So you got to get the right size. In this case, the right size wrench or socket would be akin to like the right stocking rate.
Stocking rate, or even the animals.
Look at that.
I mean, we
look
talked
at that.
about that.
Hey,
I'm coming. Yeah, I didn't see exactly where you were going here, but I'm with you now.
Yeah, so that right size wrench or that right size socket is like the animal or the stocking rate, and then the nut or the bolt that you're trying to loosen or tighten is like the wildlife species or the ecosystem that you're trying to manage, right? So you got to fit the right stocking rate and the right animal to the right application, to the right management goal.
I like that. And I mean, we talked about that in the episode, to extend your socket metaphor. I'm totally sold on that now, is goats in forested environments and cows in certain environments, bison and other. And I even know from out here, maybe
the goat's like a metric wrench, right?
Yeah, sure. it could be the size of cows, even like how big they actually are in the hoof. That could have impacts on whether or not you could use grazing in wetlands or use grazing in drier areas or something like that. So, okay, I buy it.
All right,
Ding.
2 for 2. 2 for 2. All right. So fire, and I mentioned this one in the episode I did with Marcus, to me, fire is like a Swiss Army knife. All right.
Oh, sure.
If you've never seen a Swiss Army knife, if you look at it, you're like, what's this little like red hunk of metal in somebody's pocket? Why do you have it? And I think that's the way people approach fire too, is like, you're going to burn the woods? You're going to burn the prairie? What's that going to do? But then once you start looking into what a Swiss Army knife is and all the tools it has and applications it has, that's akin to fire, where you can use fire in a lot of different ecosystems in a lot of different ways to meet a lot of different management objectives.
Yeah. Okay. I like that one too. I think I'm going to give you that one because to extend that metaphor, I mean, you can imagine there's so many different ways that you could customize it. And I think Marcus talked right in that episode about like really small scale fires or really large scale fires, using fire to fight fire, for Pete's sake. I mean, that's like the ultimate in Swiss Army knife utility. Right. And then seasonal variation in the use of fire. You could burn in the fall to favor forbs and prairies, and spring to favor grasses and prairies. Or you can, as you mentioned, you can burn in like, I think almost every ecosystem in North America. I mean, it's not every ecosystem in North America that's fire adapted, with like relatively regular fire return intervals, but it is the vast majority of them. And in that way, it could be a very, very versatile tool that transcends the boundaries of many different ecosystems. So, okay, ding, three for three, Jared. I'm impressed. I was initially skeptical of the idea.
I will say this is kind of where things may take a turn for.
Okay, you could quit while you're ahead.
Yeah, well, I can't do that. I can't do that. I spent too much time on this, and so you have to stay with me, right? This might be a stretch. All right, so the next one is a gun. Okay, and I had a few different things for this one. And because of the way that you and Pat talked about it in like very different context of like very direct, like removing animals from the population as a way to manage habitat, or like as a catalyst to create habitat for different species, I had a harder time with this one. So I had a couple different tools, but what it came down to is the gun is like WD-40. All right. Stay with me.
Okay.
Stay with me. The gun is like WD-40, and I have my notes down here, because I think it can really grease the wheels of conservation, right? So it really kind of sets habitat management in motion from a funding aspect, from a policy aspect, from engagement aspect. So it really kind of gets things going to really help people become interested in habitat management on private lands and public lands. So that's one application of it. All right. But WD-40 is also used to protect metal from getting rusted, right, or degrading. So now we can use the gun as a way to remove overpopulated animals like deer.
Yeah.
As a way to protect
as a habitat management tool.
Ecosystems, right?
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah. The mountain lives in fear of the deer, like she said in that Leopold quote. Okay, I'm impressed with that one. Yeah, you split that hair. You're right, because there are those like two different ways of thinking about it, and I like that analogy, the protection and the greasing the wheels of conservation. So ding.
Like I said, I spent a lot of time on this.
That one was good. Okay,
too much time.
Now I have high expectations for number 5.
Oh man, and you're going to do this to me. So I ran out of time, and that's where I stopped. So the plow. Okay. So we have to workshop some things for the plow. Adam. We got to figure out what it's like.
Okay. Oh, wow.
So I racked my brain trying to think the plow, and I had 2 things I had down were I had a sander down, and I had a sander down because you can kind of use the plow to kind of refinish something, or to kind of create a new layer and expose a new layer Ryan talked about using the plow literally to remove reed canary grass
Yep.
and start anew.
Yep.
And that's kind of what you can do with the plow. But that's a limited context, and it doesn't maybe fit some of the other uses of the plow. So that's one of the had down.
So I guess I'm trying to think along the lines of the way you presented the other 4 tools and what would work. I do kind of like the sander thing because it does. The other thing is you could adjust the grit, right? Like you could have, I don't know, like I know I use like 60 grit on coarse things, and then I've polished epoxy with like 3200 grit before. Like you could adjust the grit and have like different impacts, and that's definitely true of the plow, like how we apply it. So I'm not totally unsold on that. I like that. I think it is true that the plow is probably the least ecologically based. There's not a lot of there wasn't like any ecological parallel to like steel implements being drugged through the soil.
But the only thing would be bison wallows
Yeah.
or bison stampedes.
In the scale at which we see the plow used, in modern agriculture is just not like there is no evolutionary precedent
There you
for
go.
that.
See, that fits better with the sander. You're kind of sanding the rough spots down, kind of creating.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does. I'm just trying to think like what is it about the plow that makes it uniquely suited. And then the other thing is like it plants food plots and it does like real tangible type things and for some organisms that could be really consequential. And I imagine we could think of a tool, but I don't know. I think I'd be willing to give you a slightly less enthusiastic, but a bell ring
So a
for
shorter
the
bell ring.
sander. Just imagining that range of conditions in which we apply that tool. And it's honestly, of all of them, perhaps the least used in wildlife habitat management. It has more to do with like where we don't use the plow as places where we do wildlife habitat management. And all those other ones are very naturally sort of integrated, and all of them have sort of an evolutionary or ecological like precedent. Like there's been grazing animals in North America forever. There's been fire in North America forever. There's been predators, which we could use the gun in this case as a predator. There's been top predators, including people in North America for a long time. And then there's, of course, been disturbances like insects or beavers or a range of things, pathogens that kill trees and manipulate forest stands in North America forever. So really the only one that's really totally novel is this like plow thing. So I think I'll go for it. Like we could say it's a sander, and in wildlife habitat management, in its like relatively restricted applications of the actual implement, it's used for finesse things.
Yeah, and if you think about early textural communities, especially here in the East, you kind of use the disc to kind of wipe away the slate of the thick grasses and kind of start anew and new layer. There we go. I like it. So if you've stayed with us this long, I'd be interested to know what people have ideas on these tools. Like if people think I'm crazy, or if they agree with me, or maybe some ideas that you have of how different tools in a toolbox relate to some of these various management tools.
So at Jared on Twitter for sure, if you think he's crazy. But I will
At Purdue
say,
Wildlifer.
I thought Jared was crazy for wanting to do this, and I think that I think it was a really nice discussion. So the next thing
when I pitched this to Adam earlier, he said that this might make it on the cutting room floor. So Adam, are we going to make it in the episode?
I think so.
All right, good.
Okay, so I think have settled on the 5, and we're going to go for it with the toolbox example. And I don't know that we necessarily need to do that, but what are the tools that are missing? And that is, Leopold wrote about these 5, and we spent a lot of time in examining them. And of course, in doing that, covered a lot of territory in wildlife habitat management in North America. But I don't think it was perfect. And I think there's some that maybe were around when he was around that he overlooked. And then also some stuff that's kind of come on that's become really important tools in the wildlife habitat manager's toolbox today that I think it'd be wise to have a discussion on. And we'll certainly have some more discussion on these in future episodes too.
So I'll let you start with one that you found, Adam, because I think you and I kind of maybe came to this one independently, was like one of the ones that he definitely missed. That was definitely happening.
Yeah. So
the
this is like, as a duck biologist, this is like my world. And I'm a little surprised that he didn't just sort of concisely say something like the dredge, right? Like the dredge in this case being metaphor for all of the ways that people had manipulated water in North America. And
maybe it was implied in the plow, but I would say that it probably deserves its own.
Yeah, I don't think it
category.
works, because if you think of like all the manipulations to major rivers, like with levee systems and all the drainage of wetlands that occurred. I mean, yeah, sure. For the most part, it was trying to make space for the plow, but the dredge itself and then associated, tools to drain wetlands has had a really substantial impact on wildlife and wildlife habitat across North America. So, for example, I found this report from the 1980s from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. This was like a congressionally mandated estimation of wetland losses in North America. And they look from 1780 to 1980, like the idea being basically like since independence to present at that time, how much wetland had been lost. And they estimated in the lower 48, there's of course a ton of wetlands in Alaska and they're mostly unmodified. So in the lower 48, they estimate 53% of all wetlands had been lost in that window from 1780 to 1980. And in some states, like my home state of Iowa, it's the vast majority, and our home state of Indiana, it's the vast majority. In Iowa, 89%, Indiana, 87%, Ohio, 90%,
And
California.
that's as of 1980, right? So that's 40 years ago?
Yeah.
41 years ago?
Yeah, so it's been, and there's of course been wetland protections put in place, and we think probably the majority of the drainage had occurred by that time, but still we still lose wetlands, and California was the highest at 91%. And so and it varies, across states. I think I remember something like New Jersey or something was the lowest. That probably had to do with relatively few wetlands and most of them being coastal, but the extent to which North America's landscape was modified by wetland drainage, and then even just by stuff like the exploitation of beavers that occurred from the time of European contact and all the fur industry development across North America, and of course unregulated exploitation that came along with it, really drastically changed the aquatic ecosystems of the continent. And a huge amount of work in wildlife habitat management focuses on putting these ecosystems back in place, oftentimes through the creative use of the same tool that had heretofore destroyed it, like the bulldozer, or like the dredge, or like the tile, like drain tile.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that it wasn't included or wasn't on there, because if you think about what was going on in the 30s, the Duck Stamp Act that happened in the 30s that basically was creating federal funding to protect wetlands and purchase wetlands and things like that. So certainly it was on people's mind at that time, and waterfowl populations were kind of diminished and dwindling.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's interesting that you bring that up. I hadn't even thought about that. That was a time where people were especially thinking about wetland losses because of drought and declines in waterfowl populations.
All right, so you kind of walked us through maybe the history of where the dredge comes from and maybe how it destroyed habitat for wildlife. So what are some of the ways it's now used creatively to kind of rebuild some habitat for waterfowl or whatever species?
I mean, there's examples all across the continent. And this, of course, is this is my world. And so I would have happily done a whole episode on this. And I'm sure we're going to come back to this, I'm sure. But, wetland restoration has been really a high point of wildlife conservation efforts in the 20th century and early 21st. In fact, if we look at across North America, breeding bird population trends, like grassland birds are tanking, forest birds tanking, insectivorous birds, all these different guilds of birds are on consistent long-term declines. And waterfowl and water birds generally, wetland dependent birds, are generally on an increase from like the mid 20th century. And that's because one, favorable environmental conditions, like it's been raining in the prairies and so lots of ducks are around. But two, there's been a really concerted effort to do wetland restoration. And that wetland restoration takes different forms all across the country. Some examples that come to mind are like, let's see. I worked on a wetland in Wisconsin called Horicon Marsh. It's a 33,000 acre cattail marsh that was historically associated with a river. It's still associated with a river, but it was, of course, drained through dredging and leveeing. And today they use that same system of levees and some modified ones to manipulate the water levels in a way that create really diverse wetland vegetation and diverse conditions for a bunch of species of wildlife on Horicon National Wildlife Refuge or on the state owned and managed portions of that marsh. So that's one example. In the southern United States, there's a ton of work on managing aquatic environments through ditches and levee systems associated with what would have historically been like floodplain environments. And that can come down to what they call moist soil management, where they're manipulating water levels to like 2 inches of height. I mean, they're like really fine scale manipulations in water levels. And there's this like whole science called moist soil management, where they're trying to time how fast the soil dries out and how much water's on there to promote the growth of certain plants that'll feed literally millions of ducks that come down from Canada and the upper United States to spend their winters.
Here's a connection to the tools, Adam. In the episode that I did with Jordan, he talked about bottomland hardwood forest restoration and planting different species of hardwoods on those 2 to 3 inch gradients,
that's right,
of water level. So green tree reservoirs are really big in the western Kentucky and Mississippi area. So creating bottomland hardwood forest for a lot of wildlife species and allowing water back in there.
Yeah, and all those systems have been often very modified, either through like direct manipulations of the channel or construction of levees or others. So yeah, there's just so much interesting stuff. And then of course you go out west and there's all sorts of challenges with water quantity. Many of those connect back to wildlife and wetland drainage and wetland modifications or the exploitation of the beaver. And there's a lot of work going on to try to put water back onto those landscapes for all the diverse species of wildlife that rely on those literally oasis ecosystems in the middle of an otherwise very arid landscape. So definitely one that I think Leopold could have easily said, like, add the dredge right up there with the plow, and we'd have been off doing a really cool episode on wetland habitat. But we'll do that later.
Yeah, so I think that's a good one, and certainly one that you could argue that he missed. And, again, connecting it to another episode, Pat Dorsey mentioned Ducks Unlimited.
Yeah.
Was it 14 million acres they conserved since 1937? So ducks and water and wetlands were on people's mind at that time, certainly. And so there's been a lot of effort that time period to restore wetlands and create wetlands.
Yep. Yeah, and it's an active area of wildlife habitat management that we'll definitely want to explore. So okay.
So more on the nuts and bolts of moist soil management and wetland management later.
It's coming. Okay, so you've got one for us now, another perhaps overlooked or certainly modern important tool in the wildlife habitat management toolbox.
Yeah, so this is the first one that came to my mind when I look at those 5 tools, and I would say that it is not one that Leopold missed because it's one that wasn't available or even around when he wrote that book in 1933, and that's Herbicide. So I think Herbicide today is an extremely important tool that we have from a management standpoint, and I'll kind of cover some of the things that we can do with herbicides in a minute, but just kind of give you a history of it. If we think about herbicides, and so I want to be clear that there's always a common confusion when you talk about herbicides versus pesticides. pesticides include herbicides. So not all pesticides are herbicides, but all herbicides are pesticides.
Yeah, okay.
So pesticides includes insecticides, fungicides, all that stuff. So we're specifically talking about herbicides here.
Which control vegetation.
Correct. Control plants. So just a little bit of history. When we look at the history of herbicides, natural herbicides have been around for a long time in the form of salts. So people would salt fields and salt areas to kill plants, and usually it was used as like a burn down. So they were killing any vegetation that was there. So using salts, even using things like sulfuric acid in the 1800s as a way to kind of kill vegetation. But we didn't get our first synthetic herbicide until the 1940s. And one of the first ones on the market was 2,4-D, which is a broadleaf herbicide. So again, wasn't available, wasn't something that people were thinking about in the 1930s necessarily. And then we really didn't start to see a super wide use of a lot of herbicide until about the 1990s, when glyphosate came on the market, and you see a skyrocket in the amount of herbicide that's been used on the landscape. And that was with the invention of Roundup Ready crops. So they could use glyphosate, which kills just about anything, on crops without killing the crops.
Yeah.
So you could make the case that this would fit that definition and that quote that Leopold had about using these tools, in that herbicides have actually killed or reduced or destroyed a lot of habitat for wildlife. In the case that I talk about a lot when I give talks about herbicides and things is the importance of weeds. And so things like common ragweed and species like that have weed in their name, or milkweed, are extremely important plants from a lot of different wildlife standpoint. And the thing I always go back to is northern bobwhite. There's not a seed that they would eat before common ragweed. It's a really important, high energy, valuable seed that's kind of abundant on landscape. But with the invention of herbicides and the use of things like Roundup and Roundup Ready crops, we've eliminated those weedy fields, which would provide brood cover for things like bobwhite or turkey and such. So by eliminating some of these weedy plants, we've eliminated habitat for wildlife in some of these agricultural areas.
Yeah, there was a study done in Iowa, actually, just published in 2010, and they happened to do some surveys in crop fields in 1999 before they had introduced Roundup Ready crops in those fields. And they found, an initial survey conducted in 1999 found that low densities of common milkweed occurred in approximately 50% of Iowa corn and soybean fields. In 2009, common milkweed was present in only 8% of surveyed fields. And the area within infested fields occupied by common milkweed was reduced by approximately 90% compared to 1999. So over a period of just 20 years, because of the introduction of Roundup Ready crops in this case, the nursery plant of the monarch butterfly, a species that's now a candidate for listing on the Endangered Species Act, had reduced by something like 90% in row crop fields. So definitely an example of some of the harm that could be done to wildlife and wildlife habitat from herbicides.
So that's the way it fits that first part of the definition. But now when you think about how can we use herbicide creatively to create and manage habitat for wildlife, and the first thing that comes to mind is obviously being judicious in its use. But the best place that herbicides have in our toolbox is really from an invasive species standpoint, right? So we really need them as a tool to combat invasive species, which also destroy habitat for wildlife. So I always think of, and people may get mad at me when I say this, but one of the worst invasives we have in Indiana is tall fescue. From a bobwhite standpoint, certainly. And we can use herbicide as a way to control some of those exotic cool season grasses when we're trying to manage for native plants and native communities. Things like bush honeysuckle in our forested environments. Herbicide is the most effective way that we have to control bush honeysuckle and species like that.
Yeah, I really like that example. It's just like the other tools that we started at the top of the episode here talking about, like, well, it's all about like all things in moderation, like just the judicious application of these things. And you're right, herbicide is a tool that's really almost unrivaled in its utility for like precision control of certain plants, which in a really modified environment that we do wildlife habitat management in these days, it's really a critically important tool to be able to use for those sort of precision applications of dealing with problematic invasive plants or dealing with imbalances in ecosystems created by all of the change we've seen in these ecosystems.
Yeah, and I think it couples well with other management tools, with other tools in our toolbox. And example is we have some management projects going on in some of our forested properties here in Indiana, where we're trying to control things like multiflora rose, bush honeysuckle, autumn olive, and even winged burning bush. And this stuff is, 6 feet, 7 feet tall. And if we went in there with herbicide by itself, we would have to use so much herbicide to cover all of the plants that are in there. We would be using, hundreds of gallons of herbicide in order to control those. So what we've done in some cases is we went through there with a fire first, which have top killed most of those plants. And then we can come back and use a significantly less amount of herbicide to control the sprouts that are coming up. So we've used fire as a way to more judiciously use herbicide. And you can use the same thing with, going back to one example of goats grazing. Goats grazing isn't going to eliminate things like multiflora rose, but it's going to reduce their height to where you can more easily kill them with things like herbicide.
Yeah, that's cool. We actually have a scenario here in Iowa where we're managing a prairie that we have invasion from Ailanthus or tree of heaven, and we're doing the opposite strategy. Ailanthus is known to respond to being top killed. We always say if you kill one, 1,000 come to the funeral. And if you top kill it with fire, we know that this Ailanthus is just going to take off and be a real big problem. And so what we've done is we have this like sort of long-term approach where we're trying to get control of it through a basal bark application of herbicide that'll go down into the roots. The plant won't have that top kill reaction. We'll get control over it with herbicide, and then we'll start to manage that prairie with fire and other disturbances once we get control. So yeah, same thing. A combination of all these tools is the solution. And in that case, it just takes like sort of an understanding of the biology of the plant, the chemistry of the herbicide and how it impacts the plant, and how you apply it. So another really good topic for another episode, I think.
That's right. We could go over a lot of different uses of herbicides, and we'll do that in a later episode. But first, Adam, I got to get back to my toolbox analogy. Because I got another one for herbicide, all right? What is it in a toolbox that you can never be without? What is one thing?
Is it duct tape?
It's duct tape.
Okay.
All right? So herbicide to me is like duct tape. And I say it's like duct tape because it's really good at solving problems when you need it, right? But you're not going to build a house or a boat or anything like that out of duct tape, right? So you're not going to build an ecosystem or habitat with duct tape alone or with herbicide alone. But it's really good at fixing problems. Invasive species being one of the biggest problems. And you can use it in combination with other tools to create those ecosystems and create those environments that are beneficial to different wildlife species.
I like it. I'll give you the bell ring on that one.
All right. Awesome.
Okay. So now we want to think of other tools that maybe we're missing, or other ways to think about ways that we go about doing wildlife habitat management. And I think those first two were our really tangible ones, the wetland one that I was kind of crazy about, and the herbicide one, Jared, that you bring a lot of expertise to. Then we only have two more, and those are will be a little more concise and just kind of thinking out loud. And the first one I wanted to pitch to you, Jared, was urbanization. And I think if we had to put it in that sentence, it would be something like wildlife can be restored by the creative use of urban sprawl. I don't really know. I don't know how to.
How about this? Urban planning?
Oh, that's good. Urban planning. Okay. Oh, that's good. Okay, so urban things, because we should remember that particularly in like the eastern part of the country and the western, like on the coast, essentially western part of the country, like urbanization is one of the biggest threats to wildlife and wildlife habitat, because of it's just sort of like steady march out from the historical boundaries of cities and into urban areas, or excuse me, into rural areas or into natural areas. And I don't know. And so we could say wildlife could be restored by the creative use of the same tool that is heretofore destroyed it, in this case being urban challenges. Urbanization is definitely a chronic problem, but we see these really cool examples of innovation in urban spaces that create space for wildlife and for people to enjoy wildlife, like urban green space, or being very intentional about development along certain sensitive ecosystems like riparian areas or wetlands or large intact tracts of forest, that people have sort of learned from our mistakes and started to essentially do better in the way that we lay out our cities. I was reading this paper that's an important paper on like urban ecology and birds in anticipating this. And they have this figure that's kind of stuck with me. It's this XY chart. This is going to be super in the weeds. I'm like the in the weeds guy. So XY chart on the Y axis, the vertical axis, persistence of change, and on the X axis, similarity of the matrix to natural ecosystems. And so what they're saying there is like, you can have persistence of change would be like timber harvest. Like, you harvest it, but it grows back to trees relatively quickly. So it'd be like relatively low on the persistence of change. And then similarity of the surrounding ecosystem could be low, or it could be very high. It could be low if it was like a clear cut. Like you take a mature forest, cut it down. Sure, it eventually grows back into a mature forest, but in the short term, it's going to be very different. Anyway, if we put agriculture on that, it's very different from the surrounding natural ecosystems, but at least it's not persistent. We can bring sort of wildlife habitat back from agriculture. That's not true from urban ecosystems. Once you have an urban ecosystem, you're not going to bring it back for the most part. Like once you've paved it over, I mean, there are notable exceptions, but once you've paved it over or built a house, you can't bring it back. But with smart, thoughtful, and intentional design of landscapes or urban green spaces, you can make it more similar to the forested or grassland environments or even desert environments in which that city resides. And so I just think it's an important point to make, is that we remember we can make a lot of ground in urban spaces if we apply our understanding of wildlife habitat needs to design of things like backyard landscapes or urban parks.
Yeah, and I think, the important thing to think about when we think about this one is like, we're not going to use urbanization as a tool we're not going to like go build a city somewhere to create habitat for wildlife, but we can be strategic about how we do things to incorporate, wildlife habitat in the planning process. And I think what you said about backyards is really important from a suburban standpoint, is how we design suburbs and how, what landscaping plants we use can be beneficial in thinking about, backyards serving as a potential area for migrating songbirds or migrating butterflies or whatever. And we can be strategic about how we put those on a landscape to maybe create corridors or so on.
The last thing that I think we have to talk about with urban places is where the people live. And I think, like, we talked about this with the gun episode. Like, this is wildlife habitat management is as much about motivating people to do something in these places and on this land as it is about doing right by the whatever obscure species of wildlife we're talking about this week. And so I think even, some people will scoff at things like landscape design for birds, or they'll scoff at city parks because they say, oh, we belong in, places like Yellowstone or places like big national wildlife refuges or whatever. And it's like, that's really kind of an attitude that's coming out of favor in the wildlife profession these days, because we recognize where the people are. We really need to be connecting those people to wildlife and nature wherever they are. And so meet them where they are and talk to them about the peregrine falcon habitat on the edge of those buildings. Or I went to Ohio State and there was peregrine falcons nesting on the football stadium. Let's talk about those urban ecosystems and those urban wildlife habitats, so that we can sort of connect more people in this enterprise of wildlife conservation and wildlife habitat management.
I like it. And so just kind of going off that urban side and you talked about people. So the last one that I have that's, not as tangible in a sense as herbicide or wetlands, and it's people and policy, right? And so you kind of transitioning off of what you said is it's important to get people engaged in wildlife habitat management. And I think having, if we relate it back to the definition or to the quote that Aldo Leopold had, there was a time and place when we didn't value wildlife other than as an economic resource, right? And so we tended to overutilize it, and same thing with forests and so on. But now our values and understandings of these ecosystems and things have changed, and now we really do value wildlife from more than just an economic standpoint, from a recreation standpoint, from just an aesthetic standpoint. And so those values can be leveraged into support and advocacy for wildlife and wildlife habitat management. It can be leveraged into actually boots on the ground doing it. Because if you look at surveys of why people own land, especially forest land, wildlife ranks pretty high as one of the top 2 or 3 reasons why people own land, above timber harvest, above things like that. So having that public support and public engagement is having that people aspect is really important to furthering our ability to use habitat management and to get habitat management done on private lands, which for Adam and I is over 90% of our state is private lands. So having those people engaged is really important from a wildlife standpoint.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I think the only amendment I would have to the way that you presented it is just like, people have always cared about wildlife and wild places in this country. Like, native people really did. It was spiritually and culturally important. And then like people all the way back, like of European descent, always cared about these. But for whatever reason, nobody, like policy wise, they didn't care, right? It was like one attitude, and they like only cared about exploitation. Like this is the manifest destiny type thinking. Like, we are going to march across this country and we're going to exploit all these resources, and they're endless and all this stuff. And in reality, there were always people saying that was a terrible idea. And today, wildlife habitat management and wildlife conservation does a lot better job of reflecting that pluralism, the diversity of opinions and attitudes of the people that live on this land, and the way that we value wildlife. And you're right, through wildlife habitat conservation and management, we can engage people in these important discussions. And we talked about that in the gun episode a lot. Like, a lot of the gun thing was really just about people, just engaging people. And it just happened to be one example. And today, we have binoculars to engage people, or we have bird feeders to engage people, or backyard landscaping to engage people, or precision agriculture, or conservation grazing, or timber stand improvement, and like all of this wetland restoration, all this really cool stuff that engages people in wildlife conservation. And it's going to ensure that moving forward, we have the diversity of places for wildlife to live, and the diversity of wildlife still around to live there and for the people to enjoy. And that seems like a win-win.
Yeah. And I think, that you hit it on the head and I think to just bring it back to the quote that we started all this stuff with the Aldo Leopold quote about things that have destroyed habitat and how we can then use the same tools to create and restore it. It was probably the absence of policy that really led to some of that destruction, right? So not having policy at all. And now we can think about using creative policies like the Farm Bill or the Conservation Reserve Program or things like that to incentivize and create habitat and create, these different ecosystems.
Yeah, and I think that actually brings me back to another thing for the gun episode. I'm just thinking about that one a lot. And do you remember Pat in there talked about like the scientific management of wildlife? And I think that's another place where there's been a lot of really important developments. The science of understanding wildlife habitat and understanding how wildlife respond to what we do on the land has really evolved since Leopold wrote Game Management, and our approach has really changed. And I think that's probably another really important creative innovation that we want to talk about. And it's actually a perfect way to wrap up the episode and segue to what our next episode is going to be. And that is on that, like, how do we know what we're doing matters, and how do we know what we should be doing? And so our next episode, we're going to dig in on this. We're going to talk about what we're calling the Moneyball problem. That's a movie and a book reference. And you're definitely going to have to tune in to the next one to figure out how in the world Jared and I are going to connect wildlife habitat management to baseball statistics. But there's a connection, and it has to do with this scientific management of wildlife management and wildlife habitat.
I like how you ended there with science, Adam, because that's what we're about, right? That's why we have this podcast, is to break down the science of wildlife habitat management.
That's right. So that's all for today. Look forward to joining you on the next episode when we talk about habitat quality and the Moneyball question. In the meantime, like and subscribe and fill out our evaluation survey.
Habitat University is hosted by Purdue Extension and Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network is supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you liked Habitat University, subscribe and listen to the other podcasts in the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
Iowa State University and Purdue University are equal opportunity, equal access, and affirmative action institutions.